The man known to history as Franklin Delano Roosevelt was born in the town of Hyde Park, New York, on the 30th of January 1882. His father, James Roosevelt, was a Harvard graduate and a successful businessman who had interests and investments in various coal and transport companies, and also had connections with the Democratic Party, serving as the minister's secretary at the American Embassy to Great Britain in the 1850s, under the then ambassador and eventual 15th President of the United States, James Buchanan. Franklin's mother, Sarah Ann Delano, whose ancestors came to America on the Mayflower all the way back in 1620, had married James in 1880 and was a driven and intelligent woman. Her father, Warren, had once operated an opium business in British Hong Kong, where she lived for 3 years, and at one stage, Sarah also attended a girls' school in the German city of Dresden. As such, it was a well-traveled and liberal family background which Franklin was born into. In the modern world, Sarah would have undoubtedly had a successful career of her own, but she was forced by the social constraints of the time to be a homemaker, which perhaps inevitably caused her to place much of her hopes for the future on Franklin, as he was her only child. Franklin himself was an active child, who also proved to be intelligent and gifted at almost anything he undertook, and he soon became adept at the sporting activities of his class, such as horse riding, shooting, tennis, golf, and polo. Instead of allowing the family's servants to educate Franklin, as was the convention of the time, Sarah chose to educate her son herself during his early years, until he was eventually sent to the Groton boarding school in Massachusetts. The headmaster of this school, Endicott Peabody, would prove to be an important guiding influence on Franklin over the coming years, teaching him the importance of Christian charity, and he would later go on to officiate at Roosevelt's wedding in 1905. In 1900, Franklin's father, James Roosevelt, died, which was a devastating blow for 18-year-old Franklin. Despite this, his prospects improved a year later when his cousin Theodore Roosevelt was elected President of the United States. His commanding and energetic leadership soon made him Franklin's new role model. It was around this time that Franklin enrolled at Harvard College in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where he failed to shine academically. He stated later that he studied economics for 4 years and everything he had been taught was incorrect. He did distinguish himself, though, as editor of the Harvard Crimson, the daily newspaper published by Harvard students since 1873. Despite him not enjoying his time at Harvard, Franklin graduated regardless in 1903 with an A.B. in history, and then, after dropping out of law school in 1908, joined the Wall Street firm of Carter, Ledyard and Milburn, working in the company's Admiralty Law Division. While working here, he was known to tell his co-workers that he intended to become the President of the United States one day, just like his cousin Theodore. In 1902, Franklin began to court his distant cousin Eleanor, whom he had known since childhood, and after spending several years reaffirming their ties by means of family meetings and correspondence, Franklin successfully proposed in 1904. Eleanor herself was the youngest daughter of Theodore Roosevelt's brother Elliot, whose branch of the Roosevelt family had split from Franklin's in the 17th century. Grandfather. In the shape, the couple were married on the 17th of March 1905, despite fierce opposition from Franklin's mother, Sarah, who thought her son was too young to marry, in the shape of Nicholas Roosevelt, who was Franklin's 4th great-grandfather and Eleanor's 5th great-grandfather. At the ceremony, Eleanor's uncle, President Theodore Roosevelt, gave her away, as her father Elliot had died in 1894. Both Franklin and Eleanor then moved to the Roosevelt family estate at Springwood in Hyde Park, where Eleanor had to endure the difficulty of living next door to her mother-in-law. The couple went on to parent 6 children together, one of whom, Franklin Jr., died in infancy in 1909. Despite giving birth to 6 children, Eleanor found married life to be difficult in many respects, and at one point stated that she found intercourse to be an ordeal that had to be endured. This lack of nearly ended their marriage, and it was only after Franklin's mother stepped in and told him that if he divorced Eleanor, she would disinherit him, that their union was spared. Despite this tumult, both Franklin and Eleanor would remain married until his death in 1945. But, perhaps as a consequence of his extramarital liaisons, it remained a union based on mutual respect or duty rather than love or passion. However, regardless, Eleanor made Franklin promise that he would never see Lucy again, which was an oath that he eventually failed to keep. This lack of natural intimacy would later result in Franklin having numerous affairs, and Eleanor herself would also go on to form close and possibly intimate friendships with a number of women. Perhaps the most notorious of Franklin's extramarital relationships was with his wife's secretary Lucy Mercer, which began in or around 1916, and which Eleanor discovered when she found letters between the two by accident to keep. In 1910, Franklin joined the local Democratic Party, which was eager to recruit him due to his family name. After being accepted and nominated, Roosevelt campaigned for a seat on New York State Assembly. After leading an energetic campaign, in which he traveled around the local area by car, Franklin won. This surprised many, as New York politics was largely dominated by the Republicans in the early 20th century. Thus, it's worth Roosevelt's capturing of a seat in New York for the Democrats on his first effort was a surprise to many. He then assumed his new responsibilities on the 1st of January 1911. Roosevelt quickly gained a reputation as something of a radical within the local Democratic Party, leading a group of so-called insurgents who were opposed to Tammany Hall, a political organization in New York City that had controlled nominations and dictated policy there since the mid-19th century, and had a reputation for corruption and looking after the interests of the rich above the working classes and the poor. Because of his opposition to Tammany Hall, Franklin soon became a popular figure with many New York Democrats, and in 1911, it's worth remembering in assessing Franklin's career that in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the political map of the United States was very different to what it is today. The Republican Party were a significant force in many of the northern states, while the Democrats were actually the party of choice of the southern states, the direct opposite of how it is today. 1911, thus, the Democrat nominations caused controversy within his family when he backed Woodrow Wilson, and not his cousin Theodore Roosevelt's campaign for the presidency of the United States. Theodore had left the Republicans after failing to secure the party's nomination to campaign during the forthcoming election, which caused divisions within the party. He subsequently ran as an independent candidate for a newly created and short-lived progressive party called the Bull Moose Party. Despite him failing to secure his cousin's backing, Theodore was not angered by Franklin's support for Woodrow Wilson, as he was, after all, a member of the Democratic Party, which he would have been forced to resign from in order to support him, and it could be said that this was, in hindsight, the correct decision, as Theodore not only lost the election, but his progressives fell into obscurity over the coming years. Franklin's decision to back Woodrow Wilson was vindicated when he won the presidential election of 1912, becoming the first Democratic president since Grover Cleveland, who left office in 1897. This election victory was a landslide for the Democrats, who won nearly 42% of the popular vote, and Roosevelt was then rewarded for his support of Wilson, when the new president appointed him to be Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1913, deputizing under Josephus Daniels. Shortly after this appointment, Franklin resigned from his seat on New York's State Assembly in order to concentrate on his career in Washington, D.C., as he was seen by many to have a promising future ahead of him due to his intelligence, work ethic, and family name. During their time in the department, both Roosevelt and Daniels both proved to be invaluable to him during the later Great Depression, as well as the Second World War, and it was this period as Assistant Secretary that forged his affiliation and love for the American Navy that would endure for the rest of his days. In 1914, war broke out in Europe, a conflict which eventually turned into the First World War, and there was a strong consensus of opinion that the United States should begin to rearm in case it was forced to join the conflict. As a result, President Wilson gave the go-ahead for an expansion of the Navy, That was accelerated after the sinking of various civilian vessels, including the RMS Daniels, oversaw the introduction of a new merit-based system of promotion within the United States Navy, as well as extending civilian control over various aspects of naval administration, in which Franklin oversaw relations between the government and the members of the Navy's civilian workforce. This position would give Franklin a great amount of experience in dealing with labor issues, as well as industrial disputes, and also in naval administration during wartime, that would both in 1915. Because of this, the United States Navy was more than doubled in size by the end of the First World War, which ended after America joined the Entente led by Britain and France against the Central Powers of Germany and the Empire of Austria-Hungary. This greatly hastened the ultimate surrender of the Central Powers in the Armistice of 1918. After the conflict, the US Navy was scaled back to peacetime numbers. In the aftermath of the First World War, President Wilson attempted to ensure lasting peace throughout the globe by establishing the League of Nations, which was first proposed and included as part of the Treaty of Versailles that was signed on the 28th of June 1919, creating the first international covenant designed primarily to maintain world peace. However, the creation of the League of Nations greatly weakened Wilson's position as president in the eyes of many Americans, particularly those of a Republican persuasion, who feared their country's sovereignty could potentially be superseded by an international governing body, and who were also opposed to any American involvement in the affairs of foreign nations. This opposition then continued to gain momentum, until finally the Republican-dominated Senate rejected the president's plans for America to join the League of Nations. Wilson's position was further undermined by him suffering a massive stroke on the 2nd of October 1919 that left him bedridden for weeks, and his administration, much like himself, paralyzed. It is no exaggeration to say that Woodrow Wilson's policies, at least in regards to foreign affairs, provided a template for Franklin Roosevelt's own political ideas over the coming decades, as he would, after the Second World War, resurrect his mentor's plans for a League of Nations in the shape of the United Nations. As it was now becoming increasingly evident that President Wilson's tenure was coming to an end, Roosevelt and his allies reached out to Herbert Hoover about the possibility of him becoming the party's next candidate for the presidency in the 1920 presidential elections. Hoover had formerly been a member of President Wilson's administration, but had never been a member of either party. In the lead-up to the election in 1920, he calculated that the Democrats were unlikely to be victorious and declared himself as a Republican, yet he failed to secure that party's nomination for the presidency by losing to Warren G. Harding in the primaries. This in turn scuppered Franklin's plans to run as vice president under Hoover. But after James M. Cox was nominated as the Democratic presidential candidate instead, he chose Roosevelt as his running mate. Yet, despite both men embarking on a campaign across the country, they were defeated by a wide margin in the election by Harding, who became the 29th President of the United States on the 4th of March 1921. The return of the Republicans to power simultaneously heralded a return of America to isolationism, in which involvement in foreign affairs was kept to a minimum. This would last until finally the sleeping giant that was the United States of America was awoken from its slumber by the rise of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan in the mid-1930s. Although his and Cox's loss in the 1920 election was a bitter pill to swallow, Roosevelt had gained valuable experience in campaigning on the national stage and was now a major figure within the Democratic Party. He was viewed by many within the party entering to be the great, possibly via unwashed food or unclean water. There has since been speculation that Roosevelt's symptoms are more consistent with Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is caused by the immune system attacking the peripheral nervous system, which is a relay between the brain and limbs. But whatever the cause of his illness, Franklin was now paralyzed from the waist down and would never walk or even stand unaided again. This illness would have ended the lives of many men, let alone their careers. However, Roosevelt evidently possessed great reserves of strength and determination, as he then set about trying to lead a normal a life as possible to ultimately facilitate his return to mainstream politics. He did this by having the pedals of his car adapted so he could brake and accelerate by hand, and even had a pair of iron braces constructed to enable him to stand or walk with assistance, where he would use his waist to swivel each limb in turn, enabling him to move upright for short distances in the party, to be the great hope of the left wing within America going forward. However, Franklin's hopes and dreams would soon be almost completely dashed when, in August of 1921, he began to experience terrifying symptoms of paralysis from the waist down, combined with bladder and bowel dysfunction. The diagnosis for these ailments was grim to say the least, as Franklin had contracted poliomyelitis, otherwise known as polio, an infectious disease caused by the polio virus that is often transferred from person to person by infected fecal matter entering the mouth. Despite these innovations, Franklin would spend the majority of his waking hours sitting in one of his custom-built wheelchairs, meaning that he would often have to be carried up and down flights of stairs in buildings where no elevators were installed, and this soon prompted him to have a service lift adapted in his home in Hyde Park, which enabled him to travel between floors unaided. Over the coming years, Franklin would go to great lengths to ensure he was never publicly photographed in his wheelchair, and would, when giving speeches or appearing in public, often be seen to stand by using his steel leg braces along with the literal support of an aide or one of his children. For the time being at least, Roosevelt's illness meant that he had to withdraw from frontline politics for a time during the 1920s so that he could come to terms with his disability, both mentally and physically. It was during this time that Roosevelt visited Warm Springs in Georgia for the first time. Located in the west of the state, Warm Springs is home to mineral springs which flow nearly constantly at a temperature of 90 degrees Fahrenheit or 32 degrees Celsius. Beginning in the early 19th century, Georgians had begun spending time here in a belief that the warm thermal waters were good for recuperating from illnesses. It had become one of the most well-known thermal springs in the United States by the 1920s, and so in October 1924, Roosevelt set off for Georgia in the hope that he would be able to regain some of the strength in his legs by bathing and exercising in the water there. He would never meet with the success he desired in that respect, but Warm Springs nevertheless became central to his life. Over the years, he engaged in extensive charitable activity here, founding the Roosevelt Warm Springs Institute for Rehabilitation some years after his first visit, having heard numerous stories of people who had regained the use of their legs from hydrotherapy they received with the top of the Democratic Party, for which he would eventually give presidential nomination speeches in 1924 and 1928. Although these speeches were outwardly a show of support for the Democratic nominees, they were in reality dress rehearsals for Franklin's own political resurrection, as he calculated that he could not hope to win any future Democratic nomination, let alone the presidency, without being seen to be able to stand. During both addresses, he wowed the crowds with his oratory, whilst gripping the podium with all his strength in a desperate effort to remain upright. This effort to appear mobile was in large part due to Franklin's fear that his disability would be used against him by his Republican rivals, whom he In the 1930s, the Institute became the only center of its kind dedicated to treating patients with polio. Each Thanksgiving, Roosevelt would host an event here for the patients, and when he became president some years later, he constructed what he called the Little White House at Warm Springs. Such was the centrality of the place and the Institute to his life by the 1930s. Despite his retreat from frontline politics in the early and mid-1920s, Roosevelt still maintained close connections with the top of the Democrats. Would claim his inability to walk would also impair his ability to govern. It is certainly remarkable that throughout his lifetime and his later presidency, the true nature of Roosevelt's disability would remain unknown to the vast majority of the American public, who thought him requiring assistance to walk was due to him being lame or arthritic. Despite Franklin's public support, the Democrats were defeated in the presidential elections by the Republicans in both 1924 and 1928,
largely due to the fact that the economy was booming and also because the party was divided on various issues such as prohibition, which banned the production of alcohol from 1920 to 1933. Indeed, Roosevelt himself, like many men of his class, enjoyed drinking expensive cocktails, and along with chain smoking, this would become one of his guilty pleasures, ones which were unaffected by prohibition. In the lead-up to the 1928 election, Al Smith, who was the Democratic nominee for the presidency, was forced to step down as governor of New York, as he could not, by law, hold the position as well as the presidency, meaning that an election had to be held to appoint a new governor as a consequence. Smith, fearing a Republican landslide, then asked Roosevelt to run as the Democratic candidate for the governorship of New York, and after a hard-fought campaign, Franklin was eventually triumphant, winning by the slender margin of 1% of the vote, making him the head of government in America's most populous state and a frontrunner for the next Democratic presidential nomination in 1932. In contrast to this, the Democrats and Al Smith were crushed in the presidential election, losing heavily to Herbert Hoover, an election result which historians broadly view as being reflective of the widespread anti-Irish and anti-Catholic sentiment which still prevailed in America during the first half of the 20th century, Smith being Roman Catholic and of both Irish and Italian ancestry. This election defeat effectively ended Smith's ambitions of claiming the top job, though he would later go on to become the president of Empire State Incorporated, which was the company responsible for the construction of the marvel of architecture and engineering, that is the Empire State Building in Manhattan. In the year following the election, on Tuesday the 29th of October 1929, the Wall Street crash sent the world's economy into turmoil, causing share prices on the New York Stock Exchange to collapse over the weeks that followed. This crash was primarily caused by a huge amount of speculative public investment being made in the US stock market during the late 1920s, in which millions of Americans invested their life savings into the stock market in the hope of making a fortune by buying shares in what they hoped were up-and-coming companies and/or commodities. To cash in on this boom of investment, many people even took out loans in order to buy more stocks and shares, and when no further loans could be obtained, they then bought stocks on an IOU basis in the hope that they would be able to pay at a later date, as and when they made a profit. Another factor was corruption and insider dealing, which was undertaken by men such as Joseph P. Kennedy, the father of President John F. Kennedy, who during the 1920s sought to buy worthless stocks en masse, which made them appear to be a good speculative investment to the untrained eye. This mass buying inflated the price of these stocks and shares, which Kennedy and his like would then cash in on by selling them to inexperienced investors, such as the general public, who would, in the end, lose nearly all their money when the stock market crashed. Kennedy would go on to make millions during the later Great Depression itself by buying up potentially valuable real estate and land at reduced prices, which he would then later sell when the market improved over the coming decades, which at least in part funded his family's rise to power in US politics. No one knows exactly what triggered the massive selling of stocks that initiated the Wall Street crash, but historians and economists have since speculated that a combination of rumor, hearsay, and the spread of panic caused a chain reaction of mass selling that flooded the market, and as a result caused stock prices to tumble and millions of dollars to be lost. It should also be noted that the Wall Street crash was not the sole cause of the following Great Depression, but it certainly did undermine the confidence of the American public in the country's financial institutions, particularly the banks, as well as the government and the Federal Reserve. Indeed, although many of America's smaller local banks were still solvent and soundly run, the larger banks had, during the market boom of the 1920s, invested their customers, investors, and depositors' money into the US stock market, meaning that when the crash came, the banks lost millions of dollars of their customers' money that they were then unable to give back due to lack of funds. This meant that the banks were soon forced to deny cash withdrawals to the American public, which caused a panic-driven chain reaction or bank run across America and then the wider world, as millions of people rushed to withdraw their non-existent savings. The lack of cash flow inevitably crippled consumer spending as well as lending, meaning that there was a mass shortage of capital within the American economy and, as a result, businesses laid off workers in their millions or closed altogether. As America was the largest economy in the world at that time, the contagion spread across the globe as international loans were recalled in the desperate search for money and private investment was slashed. The recall of these international loans inevitably damaged the economies of countries around the world who were still struggling to recover from the devastation of the First World War, particularly nations such as Germany and Japan, who then saw a rise in radical nationalistic political parties who would seize power over the coming decade and plunge mankind into another world war. This panic and lack of capital was then further compounded by President Herbert Hoover's administration itself, as it thought the crisis would be short-lived and therefore refused point-blank to stimulate the economy with quantitative easing, which would have involved the printing of money. This would have then enabled the banks to stay open and lending and investment to continue. The government then arguably made things worse by raising import tariffs on international trade, which did nothing but damage businesses across America and around the world, as it only restricted international transactions as well as the flow of goods. The Wall Street crash and the Great Depression which followed inevitably damaged Herbert Hoover's reputation, particularly concerning economic matters, and with the end of Hoover's first term fast approaching, Franklin Roosevelt stepped up his plans to run for the Democratic nomination for the presidential election in 1932. To help secure his future candidacy, Roosevelt first sought re-election as governor of New York by enacting and advocating various reforms to alleviate the crisis, such as setting up an employment commission, endorsing unemployment insurance and aid to farmers, as well as better pensions for the elderly. These policies clearly resonated with New York's population, as he then won the state election by a 14% margin over his Republican rival. This solidified Roosevelt's position as the front-runner for the Democratic nomination for the presidency. During the following months, he appointed his campaign team and ramped up his plans for the forthcoming Democratic National Convention in 1932, at which he clinched the party's nomination by defeating Al Smith, the party's defeated candidate in the 1928 election, who came a distant second to Roosevelt in the race to become the Democratic candidate. Roosevelt then, along with his running mate for the vice presidency, John Nance Garner, launched his presidential campaign, in which he pledged his support for America's workers by promising better regulation of the economy, stock market and banking system, along with the cutting of trade tariffs, financial help for farmers and investment in public works, in order to end the Great Depression. Franklin then went on to defeat Herbert Hoover by a massive landslide in the 1932 presidential election, by winning 57% of the popular vote and crucially securing control of both houses of Congress, meaning that he was able to pass legislation with greater ease without Republican interference. Roosevelt, though, nearly never made it to the Oval Office at all. On the 15th of February 1933, 17 days before he was due to be inaugurated as president, Giuseppe Zangara, a mentally ill Italian-American, came close to assassinating Roosevelt following a speech he had given in Miami. Zangara was a 32-year-old laborer who was born in southern Italy and who had come to the United States in the early 1920s. He had extensive health problems which resulted in chronic pain. These contributed to his deteriorating psychological state in the early 1930s. Why he attempted to kill the president-elect has never been fully resolved, but most believe that he was at least partially insane. During Roosevelt's speech at the Bayfront on the night of the 15th of February, Zangara, who was just 5 foot tall, stood on top of a folding chair to rise over the crowd and fired off numerous shots. All of them missed Roosevelt, but 5 bystanders were injured, including Anton Cermak, the mayor of Chicago, who had accompanied Roosevelt to Miami. Cermak later died in hospital. Zangara was put on trial and executed just 5 weeks later after being found guilty of first-degree murder. Conspiracy theories have abounded since, that Zangara was a hired hitman and that the target was actually unemployed, who and a further 2 million people were on the streets and in a state of near starvation. On top of this, food prices had fallen by nearly 60%, meaning that farmers were now facing ruin, and in addition, tens of thousands of banks were refusing cash withdrawals, which meant that businesses could not pay their employees and families could not buy food or goods. It is hard to fully appreciate the misery caused to the average American by the Great Depression. Even the difficult years following the financial crash of 2008 were mild by comparison. In order to address overseeing a fight to crack down on organized crime in Chicago. But the reality seems that Zangara's target was almost certainly Roosevelt, and he had no motive beyond a general disaffection towards society. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was inaugurated as the 32nd President of the United States on the 4th of March 1933, when he gave one of the most famous speeches in American history, stating, quote, "So, first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance." This rallying cry was important, as the American economy had slumped to new lows in the final months of the Hoover administration, making the task that now faced Roosevelt an extremely difficult one, as 1/4 of the workforce was unemployed. In order to address this and take action after the lethargy of Hoover's administration, Roosevelt now proposed a new program of mass public investment and government-created jobs to expand America's infrastructure and get people back to work and prosperity. 3 decades earlier, his cousin Theodore Roosevelt had stated in a speech as president that he was going to give the American people a square deal by taking on the ruthless, successful industrialists or robber barons of Gilded Age America, as well as reducing inequality in the country. Now, Roosevelt sought to deliberately echo his cousin 30 years later, when he declared at the start of his own presidency that the American people would have a New Deal, through which the federal government would pull them out of the Great Depression and back to work and prosperity. During his tenure as state governor of New York, Roosevelt gave regular radio broadcasts direct into people's homes that he named his fireside chats, in which he would lay out his plans for governance or address other issues. After becoming president, Franklin continued these broadcasts on a national scale, informing the population of what he planned to do to address the economic turmoil. Almost immediately upon assuming his role as president, Roosevelt sought to address the paralysis that was gripping the banking system, when on the 9th of March 1933, he passed the Emergency Banking Act that gave him the power to control bank opening times and also enabled him to order the Federal Reserve Bank to issue currency so that cash withdrawals could recommence. Finally, these fireside chats took advantage of the dominant form of media in the country at the time, the radio. Though it may seem retrograde today, Roosevelt was being entirely modern in his day to turn to the radio to reach out to millions of Americans and galvanize public sentiment around his administration's new policies. Finally, here was the quantitative easing which Hoover's administration had failed to provide. This action had the desired effect, as 6 days later, on the 15th of March, the banks reopened, causing share prices to rise by 15% as a consequence, as public deposits and withdrawals resumed. This effectively ended the bank run. After this, Roosevelt then initiated his program of relief, recovery and reform as part of his strategy for ending the Great Depression, the New Deal. He started by setting up the Federal Emergency Relief Administration in May of 1933 that was established to provide assistance to state governments by means of loans as well as grants, so that they could relieve unemployment through public works programs. Later that year, he signed a repeal that brought an end to prohibition, largely in an effort to help stimulate the economy and increase tax revenue, along with people's morale. Shortly after signing the repeal, Franklin stated that he thought this would be a good time for a beer. These reforms were also augmented by the setting up of the Public Works Administration that would come to spend nearly $7 billion over the next decade, which is a massive figure in today's money, by initiating infrastructure projects throughout the country from roads to railways to dams and schools. Much of the infrastructure of the United States, which is still in use today, was built as a result of the New Deal of the mid-1930s. This glut of state investment was then further increased by the establishment of further agencies, including the Civilian Conservation Corporation, that got 250,000 young men back into work in more local rural projects, as well as the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which helped industry with funding for railroads along with large infrastructure projects. On top of this, the Federal Trade Commission helped farmers and homeowners with mortgage relief, and the Agricultural Adjustment Act aimed to raise commodity prices by paying farmers to reduce their food production by leaving fields bare and cutting back on livestock. To ensure workers were better paid and fairly treated going forward, the President then brought in the National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933, which was enacted to regulate industry and ensure fair wages for workers, and also restrict production to keep prices at an even level. As well as all this, Roosevelt sought to cut federal spending by slashing military expenditure by over $700 million by restricting servicemen's pensions. However, after a campaign was instigated by veterans' lobby groups, Congress overruled him and paid out the pensions benefits in cash regardless. Yet, in the end, this gave the economy a further boost through consumer spending. From 1935 to 1936, the Roosevelt administration enacted the second part of its plans for relief and reform, that is known today as the Second New Deal, which, by and large, consisted of further public investment, but more importantly, focused on economic reform across various sectors. These included the 1935 Social Security Act that ensured the federal government was, from then on, bound by law to give aid to the elderly, the unemployed, and the disabled, as well as children in need. This was augmented with a kind of basic state healthcare provision to ensure the poor had a certain degree of medical care. There then came the Works Progress Administration, or WPA, which was the largest public works program to date in US history, and which funded the building of parks, schools, bridges, and roads in nearly every community across the country from 1935 onwards. The WPA employed nearly 9 million people, whose wages would then buy food and consumer goods, that in turn pumped money back into the economy, producing the knock-on effect of generating new jobs. Next came the National Labor Relations Act that prevented the exploitation of workers by giving them fair working conditions as well as fair pay, and also ensured that industrial disputes and strikes did not occur through civil discourse between employers and employee unions. All of this had the effect of bringing an end to the Great Depression in the United States. Roosevelt's New Deal had proved enormously successful and avoided the species of extremist politics developing which had occurred in Germany, where the economic turmoil had led to the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis in 1933. It is hard to understate the achievement of Roosevelt's administration in this. As one esteemed American historical biographer, Gene Edward Smith, noted of FDR in this respect, quote, "He lifted himself from a wheelchair to lift the nation from its knees." Although Roosevelt's New Deal did produce its desired effect in getting millions of Americans back into work, it was met with fierce resistance within certain quarters of the private sector as well as the Republican establishment, who were opposed to any kind of state intervention in the economy. There is still fierce debate today as to whether the centralized power of the Roosevelt administration was in keeping with America's capitalist principles, and some even claim his program of reforms and relief was socialist in its outlook. One of the most ardent critics of Roosevelt's policies during this period was his old political ally, Al Smith, who, as a conservative Democrat, was opposed to the president's interference in private industry. During the lead-up to the 1936 presidential election, Smith tried to portray Roosevelt as a communist in all but name, and even compared him to Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin. But Smith's public criticism soon backfired in spectacular fashion, as Roosevelt's reforms had lifted millions of people out of poverty and meant that he now had the loyal support of the majority of the American public as well as the country's unions, who saw Al Smith and the business leaders opposed to the New Deal as the kind of people who had caused the economic upheaval in the first place. Roosevelt's presidency in the mid-1930s also steps towards a more congenial federal policy towards the country's huge African American population. Race relations in America had soured enormously in the aftermath of the First World War, with black neighborhoods in cities like Tulsa experiencing extreme violence, and the Ku Klux Klan re-emerging as a very significant force in American life. By the mid-1920s, the Klan had millions of members. By some reckonings, more than 1 in 10 white American males were members of it at this time, and lynchings of African Americans became a common feature of life in the American South in the 1920s. Roosevelt tried to redress this in the 1930s, tightening legislation which cracked down on vigilante attacks on African Americans. His New Deal policies inevitably gained him support from amongst black Americans, who were more likely to have lost their jobs as a result of the Great Depression. Perhaps most significantly, Eleanor Roosevelt emerged as a great champion of black Americans as First Lady during the 1930s and was sympathetic to organizations such as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP. All of this ensured that African Americans began transferring their votes from the Republicans to the Democratic Party in the course of the 1930s, beginning a mass realignment of American politics. Eventually, Roosevelt would issue Executive Order 8802 in 1941, which created the Fair Employment Practices Committee, a measure which has been deemed by historians as the most important move in support of the rights of African Americans in the workplace between the end of the Civil War in 1865 and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Hoping to capitalize on his overwhelming approval ratings, Roosevelt sought re-election as president in 1936 and won an unprecedented victory by securing all but 2 states and claiming nearly 61% of the popular vote, which was the largest margin of victory since the uncontested presidential election of 1820. Roosevelt's acquisition of 98.49% of the Electoral College remains the highest margin of victory in a contested U.S. presidential election other than George Washington's 100% votes in 1788 and 1792. Roosevelt's second term was largely dominated by him struggling to overcome the resistance of the U.S. Supreme Court that had blocked or halted several of his New Deal reforms, and he then sought to end its opposition by proposing a bill to replace aging Supreme Court justices with his own supporters. This was subsequently blocked by a cross-party coalition, who feared that Roosevelt's bill would make both he and his successors too powerful. Indeed, one of the criticisms that could be leveled at Franklin Roosevelt is that he was too controlling in his administration, as he was notoriously devious and conniving in his dealings, and famously once said that he never let his right hand know what his left hand was doing. This control of the secrecy even extended to his last vice president and eventual successor, Harry Truman, who was kept in the dark about many of Roosevelt's plans during the Second World War, including the United States nuclear weapons program. One of the few people Franklin was unable to control in his life was his wife Eleanor, who consistently lobbied him throughout his presidency on matters that were close to her heart, such as help for the poor, as well as civil and women's rights, that she promoted during public appearances and radio broadcasts, and even held nearly 350 press conferences during her husband's tenure, and, more than any other figure, created the modern position of first spouse. Eleanor would also spend much of her time traveling the country, after which she would report back to her husband on the progress of his New Deal. And it is fair to say that her activism certainly aided her husband, who, after all, could not travel easily. After returning from her visits, she would brief the president at length on the situation across the country and what actions she felt were then required. This inevitably caused a great degree of friction between Franklin and Eleanor during his presidency, as he had to juggle myriad problems as well as his wife's causes, although on the whole they came to form a formidable political partnership that earned them both the respect and admiration of millions of Americans. By the late 1930s, there were growing concerns at the rise of Adolf Hitler's Germany in Europe. The Nazis were seeking to expand Germany's borders by annexing neighboring countries such as Austria and Czechoslovakia, that along with the aggressive expansion of the Japanese Empire in Manchuria and eastern China, was starting to threaten world peace. War, it seemed, was inevitable. The United States foreign policy had since the end of the First World War been isolationist in its outlook, because many people within the country did not want to interfere in any costly European wars, which was further complicated by large portions of the US population being descendants of European immigrants from countries like Germany and Italy. Roosevelt was a believer in Woodrow Wilson's outward-looking policies and was not an isolationist himself, but his hands were largely tied by Congress and public opinion. He was, for instance, prevented from interfering in the Spanish Civil War, which broke out in 1936, and the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in the early 1930s. The outlook began to change, however, when Hitler broke his Munich Agreement with Britain and France, which had been agreed in September 1938 and had allowed Germany to annex the Sudetenland area of Czechoslovakia in 1938. The Germans, though, broke the terms of the Munich Agreement within months by invading the rest of Czechoslovakia on the 15th of March 1939. With this, Britain and France began rearming more speedily in preparation for the war which now seemed inevitable. In America, these events prompted Roosevelt to begin preparations for a possible war with the Axis powers over the coming months, as he recognized that America could no longer afford to maintain its isolationist stance, particularly as Japan evidently was bent on expansion of its own in the South Pacific, which could in time potentially threaten the United States colonies in the region, such as the Philippines. When Hitler invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany, which prompted Roosevelt to align himself with the Western Allies. When France itself fell to Germany in the summer of 1940, isolationism in the United States went into steep decline, which garnered enough support to allow the president to sanction a massive increase in military spending, along with the country's first peacetime draft that would swell the ranks of the US Army to nearly 1.5 million men by 1941. Roosevelt also proved to be pragmatic in his choice of military advisors at this time, as he appointed Republican interventionists such as Henry Stimson and Frank Knox as his Secretaries of War and the Navy respectively, both of whom were in favor of his support of Britain after the fall of France. Moreover, as both men were not Democrats, their promotions helped to win over many Republicans to the president's interventionist approach. The president then increased his support of Britain and its new Prime Minister Winston Churchill, with whom he had been in regular contact since the 1930s, by giving the Royal Navy 50 destroyer-class battleships from the First World War in return for access to naval bases across the Caribbean, which proved to be invaluable in strengthening ties between the two nations, as well as the United Kingdom's naval defences. Roosevelt had before this sought to help the European allies by passing the Neutrality Act in November of 1939 that allowed the sale of US weapons in return for cash. However, this aid to Britain, Free France, China, and later the Soviet Union would subsequently be escalated into the $50 billion program of aid that is known today as Lend-Lease, which was passed into law in March of 1941 and allowed war materials and resources to be lent or leased to allied nations under the pretext that doing so would aid US national security. It was traditional for US presidents to only serve 2 4-year periods in office, as the 2-term period was not yet enshrined within the US Constitution. This followed a precedent which George Washington had set in the late 1790s, when he refused to stand for a 3rd term, declaring that if a president were to stay in office for too long, America could devolve into dictatorship or monarchy. However, this was not enshrined in law. Rather, it was a political custom that presidents would not stand for a 3rd term, and which had been adhered to by all Washington's successors. Yet because the United States was clearly entering into another period of crisis, Roosevelt decided to break with tradition and campaign for re-election, a campaign which resulted in him winning an unprecedented 3rd term on the 5th of November 1940, In the election, he won nearly 55% of the popular vote and 38 of the then 48 states, Alaska and Hawaii not then being states. This election was timely to say the least, as less than a month later, Imperial Japan would force America into World War II by launching one of the most notorious and daring preemptive strikes in the history of warfare in an effort to secure domination of the Pacific Ocean. Although the head of the Japanese state was its Emperor Hirohito, the country's government had, since the devastation of the Great Depression, much like Germany, come under the control of militaristic nationalists who advocated the rejection of democracy along with Western liberal culture and sought to end Japan's dependence on foreign imports of raw materials by means of the creation of an Asian Pacific Empire. The first stage of this expansion took place in 1931, with Japan's invasion of Manchuria in what is now northeastern China, which was then followed 6 years later by its partial annexation of China in 1937, securing the major cities along the east coast of the country. This prompted the United States and Roosevelt to halt all exports of material from America that could aid the Japanese war effort, which included nearly 95% of Japan's oil supply. This essentially forced the Japanese to choose between halting their expansion or escalating it, the former of which was not an option. Therefore, plans were put in place for further invasions and attacks on territories and islands across Southeast Asia, as well as the Western Pacific, including British imperial outposts, along with US colonies in the Philippines. The Japanese now saw the nullification and subjugation of both Britain's Eastern Empire and America's Pacific colonies and naval bases as key to securing their supremacy over the region, and it was also decided that the United States Pacific Fleet based in Hawaii would have to be destroyed in order to ensure naval supremacy in the Far East. Plans were accordingly drawn up by the military planners in Tokyo in the late 1930s to bring this about. The likelihood of war was then increased by the appointment of Hideki Tojo as Prime Minister of Japan on the 17th of October 1941, who had long advocated a preemptive strike against the United States, and over the following months preparations were finalized with the Emperor's approval by the Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese Navy, Isoroku Yamamoto, for a massive naval task force to attack the US naval base at Pearl Harbor, along with simultaneous invasions of British and American colonies and overseas stations in the Western Pacific. In the meantime, negotiations were attempted with the aim of preventing hostilities. But when the Americans demanded the full Japanese withdrawal from China in return for the re-establishment of trade, the decision was taken by the Japanese to initiate war with the United States. On the 26th of November 1941, a massive task force set sail from the Japanese home islands under the command of Admiral Chuichi Nagumo and headed east across the northern Pacific before turning south towards the Hawaiian archipelago. This fleet consisted of 6 aircraft carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, which carried over 400 aircraft and were escorted by 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, and 23 submarines. These included midget submarines, which effectively were to be used on suicide missions. The Japanese then continued to approach Hawaii and finally attacked the islands on the morning of the 7th of December 1941, resulting in over a dozen US ships being sunk or badly damaged, including 8 battleships and over 2,000 servicemen and civilians being killed or injured. Crucially for the Americans, however, the prime targets of the Japanese, the aircraft carriers USS Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were out of port at the time of the attack, which was of vital importance as these carriers would later form the nucleus of the United States Pacific Fleet that would come to decimate the Japanese Navy over the coming months and years. One day after the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt declared war on Imperial Japan, and the same day delivered a famous speech to a joint session of the US Congress, stating that yesterday, December the 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. 3 days later, on the 11th of December 1941, Germany and Italy joined with their Japanese allies and declared war on the United States. This, in effect, sealed their doom, as the world's richest and most powerful industrial nation had now joined the conflict, with which the Axis powers could not hope to compete. Roosevelt and his generals were determined that there would be a quick retaliatory strike against Japan in the aftermath of the attack on Pearl Harbor. This need not be a massive campaign or initiative, but rather a symbolic action, one which would buoy morale at home in the US. On the 21st of December, 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt met with the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the White House, during the course of which meeting it was determined that an aerial raid would be conducted against targets in Japan itself. The planning and leading of the mission was entrusted to Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle. Over the next few months, Doolittle, who was in regular contact with Roosevelt during the planning process, organized an aerial raid whereby American bomber planes would take off from an aircraft carrier in the Pacific Ocean and strike at targets in Japan itself. What has gone down in US military law as the Doolittle Raid was finally undertaken on the 18th of April 1942. During it, 16 US B-25 Mitchell medium bombers flew over Japan, dropping bombs on Tokyo and other key cities and sites. They then carried on westwards, with most of the planes crash landing over China, where the US airmen made contact with their allies amongst the Chinese nationalists and communists, though several airmen were captured by the Japanese. The Doolittle Raid caused minimal damage to Tokyo and the other sites which were bombed, but the psychological impact on US morale at home when news of the raid was released is considered to have been immense in the early stages of US involvement in the war. The overwhelming industrial, economic and military might of the Allied alliance did not take long to manifest itself, as little more than 6 months after Pearl Harbor in June of 1942, the United States Navy, along with the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise, engaged and defeated the Japanese Navy at the Battle of Midway in the South Pacific, in which all 4 of the fleet's Japanese aircraft carriers were sunk, meaning that the country's offensive capability in the Pacific theater was effectively ended in one fell swoop. The Japanese were from this point onwards forced onto the defensive across the Pacific, and the Americans then started their operations against the European Axis powers, when they landed in North Africa in late 1942, culminating in over 300,000 Axis troops surrendering in Tunisia 6 months later. This came only a few months after Hitler had lost a further 500,000 troops killed or captured in the Battle of Stalingrad on the Eastern Front. While the generals and Joint Chiefs of Staff oversaw most of the military planning for the war, Roosevelt was heavily involved. There is no better indication of this than his role in a battle which became the turning point of the war in the Pacific against Japan. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese had spent the first 6 months of 1942 expanding very aggressively across Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific. In the early summer, they occupied the Solomon Islands in the South Pacific. On one of the principal islands here, Guadalcanal, they quickly began building an airfield at Henderson's Field, with the goal of using it as a launching pad for a more intense bombing campaign against Australia and a possible invasion. The US government was determined to prevent this, and so in early August 1942, it initiated an amphibious invasion of Guadalcanal, one of America's first major counterattacks against the Japanese after the triumph at Midway. Although the initial landing of over 10,000 Marines caught the Japanese by surprise and resulted in the capture of Henderson's Field, they quickly regrouped and counterattacked. New troops were shipped in by the Japanese, and as a result the fighting on Guadalcanal would descend into a long campaign of attrition in the jungle terrain on the Pacific Island. It would last 6 months. Roosevelt was central to the Guadalcanal campaign from its inception. He was anxious even before it was launched that, despite the policy of tackling the Germans first in Europe, that the Japanese were not given a free hand in the Pacific. Once it began and did not result in a swift victory, he consistently reaffirmed his commitment to taking Guadalcanal. Following the Japanese counterattack in the early autumn, he sent the Chiefs of Staff a message stating, quote, "My anxiety about the Southwest Pacific is to make sure that every possible weapon gets into that area to hold Guadalcanal. he subsequently ordered the dispatch of 20 more ships to the island carrying more troops and supplies. This was vital, as the Japanese launched a massive assault on the US position on the island in mid-November 1942, and had FDR not reinforced their position weeks earlier, the Guadalcanal campaign probably would have ended in Japanese victory at that point. By January, though, by which time Roosevelt's government had committed over 60,000 men to the Guadalcanal campaign, as well as scores of battleships and transports and over 1,000 aircraft, the Japanese began their withdrawal from the island, realizing Guadalcanal was lost. It was a brutal conflict, the hazardous conditions of the tropical island being such that veterans of the campaign later claimed it was the Stalingrad of the Pacific Front. But Roosevelt's resolve had won out, and the tide of war in the Pacific turned considerably following Guadalcanal. The main reasons for these Allied victories were not simply their advantages in sheer manpower, but they also lay in a colossal industrial capability the United States possessed. Between 1941 and the end of the war in 1945, for example, the Americans produced nearly 2.5 million trucks, 90,000 tanks, and in 1944 alone, produced more aircraft than Britain, Germany, Japan, and the Soviet Union combined. The entire US economy was repurposed to achieve this. This industrial might, combined with America's plentiful natural resources, were, along with the massive manpower deployed by the Soviet Union against Nazi Germany on the Eastern Front in Europe, the key to the American and Allied victory during the Second World War, as both Germany and Japan's natural resources were vastly smaller by comparison, and their industrial capacity was a fraction of the United States. Once this economic might was brought to bear, the tide of the war began to turn. Although Roosevelt agreed that the war against Hitler's Germany was to be given priority over Japan, the Americans were still able, after the Battle of Midway, to steadily retake all of the Japanese conquests in the South Pacific in a succession of hard-fought amphibious assaults over the coming years. By 1945, Japan was cut off, surrounded, and starving. There were, of course, some black spots in America's wartime record which Roosevelt must shoulder some of the blame for as the nation's president. In a conflict as bloody and compromising as the Second World War, it is inevitable that even those nations which were on the right side of history got some things wrong. A notable issue when it comes to America was its approach to the Japanese-American community within the United States following the outbreak of war with the Empire of Japan. There were approximately 127,000 Japanese Americans living in the continental United States at that time, the majority of whom lived on the West Coast, largely in California. Of these, 2/3 had been born in America and considered the United States to be their home. However, Roosevelt's administration and Congress as a whole took the position early in 1942 that these Japanese Americans were a potential fifth column of the Japanese state within America, who might seek to undermine America from within. Accordingly, in the first weeks of 1942, Roosevelt signed a series of presidential orders which effectively allowed for the mass incarceration of anyone with Japanese ancestry in America. During the course of the war, over 110,000 Japanese Americans were subsequently detained in concentration camps established in various parts of the country. This policy was overwhelmingly approved of by the US people during the war, but it has since been criticized on the grounds that those who were detained had no links to the Japanese government. In 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, which issued a formal apology on behalf of the US government to those who had been detained, and over the next 5 years, over $1.5 billion in reparations were paid to those who had been incarcerated and their families. Similarly, the Roosevelt government had been criticized for its approach to the Holocaust of Europe's Jews, which eventually resulted in the deaths of 6 million people. The argument has been that the country could have done more to take in Jews who were fleeing the Nazi persecutory policies from 1933 onwards. Yet, even as it was, the US took in somewhere between 180,000 and 225,000 Jewish refugees between the first rise to power of the Nazis in 1933 and the end of the Second World War in 1945. Moreover, once the scale of what might be occurring in Central and Eastern Europe became apparent, Roosevelt's administration established the War Refugee Board in 1944, with the goal of organizing efforts to rescue and provide relief for Jews fleeing Europe. This eventually saved the lives of thousands and perhaps tens of thousands of European Jews in the final year of the war. Consequently, Roosevelt's administration cannot be too harshly criticized for its response to the Holocaust. The US government did what it could and responded to an evolving situation. Lawmakers in the 1930s cannot be condemned for not predicting what the Nazis would do in the 1940s. In the lead-up to the opening of a second front in Europe, President Roosevelt had advocated that any Allied invasion should take place via northern France, whereas Winston Churchill, in contrast, argued that any invasion should be conducted through the Italian peninsula, stating that the country was Hitler's soft underbelly. However, the Italian theatre, in reality, turned out to be Hitler's tough old gut, as the country's hilly terrain naturally favoured a defensive campaign. Therefore, the American assertion that the major Allied invasion should be conducted through France can, in hindsight, be said to have been the correct course of action. When it was initiated, it resulted in a relatively speedy advance through Normandy after the D-Day landings in the early summer of 1944, ensuring that Western Germany was not overrun by the Soviets after Germany's collapse. Despite Roosevelt's disability, it soon became evident during late 1942 that a conference was needed between the leaders of the Allied powers in order to better coordinate the war effort. However, since the Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin refused to travel far from Moscow, the decision was taken for both Churchill, Stalin and Roosevelt to meet at the Iranian capital of Tehran in late November of 1943. This involved Roosevelt having to travel over 7,000 miles from America to the Middle East, which took a massive toll on his health. At the conference, he sought to appease Stalin by distancing himself from Winston Churchill over the future of Eastern Europe, as he did not want Stalin to think that the Americans and British were acting as a unified force. This involved Roosevelt refusing to partake in discussions regarding the post-war status of Poland, as he felt there were more pressing concerns, and seeing as the Soviets were inevitably going to occupy the country over the coming months anyway, Roosevelt calculated that it was more important to appease the Soviet dictator rather than alienate him. This cordial approach towards Stalin is further illustrated by Roosevelt's response to the Soviet leader's demand that 50,000 German officers should be shot after the war, to which the president jokingly replied that, quote, "Maybe 49,000 would be enough." This was met with outrage and disbelief from the British Prime Minister. In the end, Churchill's approach towards Stalin would prove to be correct, as Eastern Europe was subjected to nearly half a century of Soviet occupation after the Second World War. Therefore, it could be perhaps argued that Roosevelt's overly accommodating attitude towards the Soviet Union was misguided, though it should also be borne in mind that Roosevelt was anxious to keep the Russians on side for the Pacific campaign against the Japanese, which was to follow after victory in Europe was attained. However, the Tehran Conference and the 14,000-mile round trip that it entailed had a devastating effect on Roosevelt's health, as he had been under massive stress for over a decade by this time, which was no doubt due to the fact that during his presidency, America had been in an almost constant state of crisis. A chain smoker, Roosevelt had also enjoyed a daily diet of fine food and cocktails for many years, but as he was unable to undertake regular exercise, it soon became apparent that his lifestyle and workload was taking its toll, which would later be further exacerbated by him embarking on an even longer journey to meet with Stalin and Churchill in the Crimean city of Yalta in February of 1945. As a result of his visible deterioration, Roosevelt, who was still just in his early 60s, underwent tests at Bethesda Hospital, Maryland in March of 1944 and was found, to the great alarm of his attending doctor, to have incredibly high blood pressure. At one point, this hit 240 over 130. He was also found to be suffering from coronary artery disease and heart failure, effectively meaning his time was short. In an effort to avert imminent disaster, Roosevelt undertook a period of rest and recuperation over the coming months, in which he cut down his smoking to a dozen cigarettes a day, as well as a single cocktail in the evenings after meals. During this period, he also spent some weeks fishing with friends, and after returning to the White House, he only worked for 4 hours per day. Another source of comfort for Franklin during this time was the rekindling of his relationship with his former flame Lucy Mercer, who had married after the breakup of her affair with Franklin nearly 20 years before. She was now widowed, and their reunion was instigated by Roosevelt's daughter Anna, who organized for them to see one another once again, behind her mother's back. This was perhaps because Eleanor and Franklin were not close as a husband and wife by this stage, as they acted more like close friends or political allies rather than a couple. Therefore, Anna sought to alleviate her father's stress, as well as his loneliness, by helping him to see Lucy once again. However, later after his death, Eleanor discovered that Franklin had been seeing Lucy with her daughter's help, resulting in them not speaking to one another for some time. Despite the ongoing war, Roosevelt was also anxious to leave a lasting legacy on U.S. domestic policy, even as his health declined precipitously. On the 11th of January 1944, he delivered his 11th State of the Union speech, the annual address given to a joint session of Congress by the President following a precedent which George Washington had set in the 1790s, and which had been revived by Roosevelt's mentor years earlier, Woodrow Wilson. In his 11th address, Roosevelt spoke about the fashioning of a second Bill of Rights for America, one which would add new economic provisions to what the Founding Fathers had established in the 1770s and 1780s. In Roosevelt's view, it was necessary to ensure that Americans had a right to employment, decent housing, an adequate income, education, and health care. He stressed in his speech that it was not simply the moral thing for a nation to provide these basic rights to its citizens, but that if wars of the kind which America was now engaged in fighting were to be avoided in the future, all developed nations would need to create a social net in order for its citizens to avoid social unrest. The same conclusion had been reached by William Beveridge, a British academic who in 1942 had produced a report on what shape post-war Britain should take, and this may have influenced Roosevelt. Roosevelt's proposed Second Bill of Rights would become the informal framework of the Democratic Party in the post-war period. It was hugely popular, and with the exception of Dwight Eisenhower in the 1950s, the Democrats would dominate the presidency down to the end of the 1960s, largely running on Roosevelt's policy framework. Thus, Roosevelt, in many ways, shaped the Democratic Party long after his own time. It was evident by late 1944 that the Allies were going to be victorious on all fronts in the Second World War, and despite being advised not to by those close to him due to his ill health, Roosevelt decided to campaign for a fourth term as president in November of 1944. He emerged victorious once again by claiming over 53% of the popular vote and winning 36 of the 48 states, making him by far the longest-serving president in American history. By this time, the possibility of a swift victory over the Japanese had also presented itself. In early 1939, top scientists such as Albert Einstein had written to Roosevelt warning him of Germany's possible nuclear weapons program, and shortly afterwards the United States initiated the Manhattan Project with the help of many German Jewish scientists who had fled the country during the 1930s. This program eventually bore fruit on the 16th of July 1945, when the first nuclear weapon, codenamed Trinity, was successfully detonated in New Mexico. By this time, Germany had been defeated in Europe, but the Allies were preparing for a long, bloody assault on the Japanese archipelago, which some analysts predicted could result in the loss of 1.5 million troops. Thus, in order to avoid this, the United States dropped 2 atom bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on the 6th and 9th of August 1945, prompting Emperor Hirohito to announce his country's surrender on the 15th of August. This weapon, more than anything, made the United States the world's most powerful country after 1945, and until the Soviets developed their own nuclear weapons in 1949, the country was practically invulnerable as a nation, as it now had along with the atom bomb, the largest navy, air force, and economy the world had ever seen. Indeed, some US generals, such as General George Patton, were adamant that the US should continue its war effort and attack the Soviet Union. Such was the strategic advantage it enjoyed in 1945. One of Franklin Roosevelt's lasting legacies was his resurrection of the League of Nations in the shape of the United Nations, the formation of which had been first agreed between the President and Winston Churchill as early as 1941, and which was finally brought into being in San Francisco on the 25th of April 1945, at which the UN Charter was drafted, which bound all the participating nations to certain standards of human rights, as well as to the preservation of peace for future generations. Over the coming years, Eleanor Roosevelt would also play a key role in the founding of the United Nations, when she was invited by her husband's successor, President Truman, to become a delegate to the General Assembly after 1945, where she also chaired the committee that came to pass the Universal Declaration on Human Rights in 1948. She would continue to take an active role in politics and humanitarian issues until her own death in 1962. The United Nations was in many ways the zenith of President Roosevelt's political career, during which he had brought America out of the Great Depression, overseen its victory in the Second World War, and in the United Nations formed an international body whose aim was to prevent a recurrence of the massive bloodshed and suffering that had plagued mankind in the first half of the 20th century. However, Roosevelt would never live to see the world he did so much to form, as on the 12th of April 1945, while sitting having his portrait painted at his retreat, the little White House in Warm Springs, Georgia, the president complained of a terrible headache and soon afterwards lost consciousness and slumped forward in his chair. He was then rushed to his bedroom, where he was diagnosed as having suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage. A few hours later, at 3:35 p.m., President Franklin Delano Roosevelt died, aged just 63. It is no exaggeration to say that many Americans were left in despair at the president's passing, as to millions of people he was a savior who had not only delivered the country from the greatest economic downturn of the 20th century, but had also crushed Imperial Japan as well as Nazi Germany in the largest and most destructive war the world had yet seen. A day after his passing, the president's coffin, draped in the Star-Spangled Banner, was taken to Washington, D.C. and progressed through the streets of the capital, lined with thousands of mourners, before being taken by train to his birthplace at Hyde Park, where he was laid to rest in the rose garden of his Springwood estate, where he, along with his wife Eleanor, remain to this very day. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is today considered by many American historians to be one of, if not the greatest president in the history of the United States of America, generally deemed to be on the same level as George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. Although he certainly enjoyed a privileged upbringing in his early years of life, there is no doubt that he possessed immense reserves of strength and bravery to overcome the paralyzing disease that is polio. For him, to then go on to become president, let alone one of the greatest presidents in US history, is nothing short of extraordinary, and stands as a testament to his strength of character as well as his intelligence and ability. Many critics of Roosevelt's New Deal have, since his death, claimed that his programs of relief and reform were far too liberal or even socialist in their outlook, as they increased the size and power of the federal US state, which in some people's eyes is at odds with the founding principles of the US Constitution. His defenders would argue, however, that his reforms were simply necessary measures in a time of crisis that lifted millions of people out of unemployment as well as abject poverty, and set the United States firmly on course for a period of prosperity and wealth that was hitherto unparalleled in human history. Indeed, the period between the 1930s and the 1960s saw more Americans join the middle classes than any other period in US history, in considerable part owing to the legacy of the New Deal. What virtually all people can agree on is that Franklin Roosevelt successfully guided America through the greatest war in human history, from which it emerged as the world's most powerful country. Therefore, it is difficult to argue against the assertion that America was stronger as a nation, both internally and externally, after his presidency than it was before it. What is also certain is that Franklin Delano Roosevelt is one of the most important figures of the entire 20th century, as his presidency shaped the geopolitical landscape of the entire world for decades after his death, and in many ways his life and career formed the world we all of us live in today. What do you think of Franklin D. Roosevelt? Was his New Deal a socialist program that increased the power of the American state? Or was he a hero who, despite not being able to stand himself, lifted the American people from their knees and set the United States on a course to greatness? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. The woman known to history as Eleanor Roosevelt was born on the 11th of October 1884 in Manhattan, New York, the eldest child of Anna Rebecca Hall and Elliot Bullock Roosevelt. Both of her parents came from exceptionally wealthy and privileged socialite families. Despite her family's wealth and status, however, much of Eleanor's childhood was difficult, painful, and lonely. Her mother, Anna, maintained an emotional distance from her daughter and was often critical of her physical appearance, lamenting Eleanor's supposedly plain features and calling her granny to tease her for her solemn and serious manner. Eleanor's paternal aunt, Anna Roosevelt, known as Bammy, also looked upon her with disappointed pity, remarking that her niece was much too tall and her lips and teeth too large to make her a beauty. Such talk seems harsh to the modern observer, especially since all photographic evidence indicates that the young Eleanor was, in fact, a lovely girl. This kind of open criticism of a female child reveals the limited positions and opportunities open even to aristocratic women of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, who were not expected to do much more than marry well and raise children. In such a case, a girl perceived as cheerful, vivacious, and pretty, according to the conventions of the day, would almost certainly marry better than a so-called plain and serious one. Eleanor also had a complicated relationship with her father, Elliot, whom she loved dearly, but whose struggle with alcoholism meant that he was frequently absent during her childhood. When Eleanor was 8 years old, her mother died of diphtheria. Less than a year later, the same disease took her younger brother, Elliot Jr. When Eleanor was 10 years old, her father fell through a window during a bout of delirium tremens, and within 2 days died of a subsequent seizure, leaving his eldest daughter and third son, Hall, orphaned. Eleanor and Hall went to live with their maternal grandmother in Tivoli, New York, where they cleaved closely to one another. Their relationship remained close throughout their lives, and Eleanor always tried to act toward her brother as a mother might. She nonetheless spent her early adolescence frequently lonely and depressed. Even though she and Hall had moved into a fairly full house, Eleanor found little warmth among the relatives she lived with and was deeply intimidated by them. Her grandmother and aunt were stern and forbidding. Her maternal uncles, like her late father, were deep in the clutches of alcohol, and their behavior was just as erratic. Her paternal uncle, the charismatic Theodore Roosevelt, was always kind to her when he visited, but even he intimidated Eleanor with his boisterous and bombastic manner. The trauma she had suffered thus far had made her painfully sensitive, fearful, and timid, and she increasingly identified with the family opinion of herself as the ugly duckling. Eleanor's difficult childhood profoundly shaped her outlook on herself, the world around her, and her own place in it. Personal loss and poor self-esteem cultivated in her a desire above all to be loved, but also a deep compassion for the trials and suffering of others. All of these experiences served to guide Eleanor in the direction of public service. Her conviction that she was not beautiful enough inspired her to develop her inner qualities. A kind and honest heart and a sharp intellect was enough to make even the plainest woman attractive and worthy of love in the ways that counted most, Eleanor believed. This impression was strongly reinforced for her by age 15, when she was sent to Allenswood Academy, of finishing school near London, England, in 1899. Her aunt Bammy had attended the school herself as a young girl and thought it an ideal fit for her niece. The school's headmistress, Madame Souvestre, was a strong mentor in Eleanor's life, who encouraged independent thinking, social consciousness, and social engagement in her students. Eleanor later wrote that her 3 years at Allenswood were the happiest of her entire life. At last, she had friends who were like-minded and who valued her for the person she was. She was well-liked, even popular. It was therefore a bitter pill to swallow when Eleanor's grandmother summoned her home in 1902 for her debut into New York society. Eleanor was now 17 years old, eligible to be presented to society, as well as eligible for marriage. She later spoke about how miserable she found the experience of being a debutante, which is hardly surprising. She had few friends among the young people at her debut or her coming-out party after so long living in England. Moreover, since debutantes were frequently admired for little more than their looks and poise, one can imagine Eleanor's impatience with the notion of being a debutante after years at Allenswood Academy, where substance, not appearance, was stressed as all-important. She did not forget the lessons she had learned from Madame Souvestre and her schoolmates, however, and promptly became involved with the New York chapter of the Junior League upon her return to the US. She spent the next 2 years teaching physical fitness and dance classes to children in the low-income neighborhoods of New York's East Side. A few months before her 18th birthday, Eleanor began discreetly seeing her distant cousin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was 2 years her senior. They had encountered one another by chance at the New York Horse Show at Madison Square Garden, and their subsequent correspondence quickly became a romance. Each admired and loved the other for their ideals, intellect, and ambition, and Eleanor was hopeful that the life of a married woman, which social pressures dictated she undertake, might be a truly happy life after all. Franklin proposed to Eleanor in November of 1903, and she accepted. Unfortunately, the pair encountered serious opposition from Franklin's mother, Sarah Delano Roosevelt, who insisted that her son wait a year before announcing the engagement. Sarah remained against the match, doing what she could to convince Franklin to break off the engagement, but he would not be dissuaded. Sarah's opposition to their marriage and Eleanor's consistently tense relationship with her disappointed Eleanor deeply. She and Franklin had fallen in love and eagerly looked forward to their marriage. But Eleanor had also hoped that her new mother-in-law might also wholeheartedly embrace her and give her the mother's comfort she had been lacking for so many years. Sadly, her relationship with Sarah continued to be complicated and far less demonstrative or supportive than Eleanor had hoped, remaining so for many years to come. Eleanor and Franklin were married at the Delano family estate in Newburgh, New York, on the 17th of March 1905. President Theodore Roosevelt, who was Eleanor's uncle and Franklin's fifth cousin, gave the bride away. At the conclusion of the ceremony, Teddy kissed his favorite niece, slapped Franklin on the back, and joked about what a good idea it was to keep the name in the family. The New York Times likened Franklin and Eleanor's union to a royal wedding, where two scions of one of America's foremost aristocratic families joined their lives to one another. Sadly, Eleanor did not find married life to be all she hoped it would be. There was strain between herself and Franklin even before their 3-month honeymoon tour of Europe was over. Both of them loved, admired, and respected one another throughout their marriage. However, their biographers theorized their marital friction stemmed largely from the fact that they each wanted the other to play a role in the marriage, of which neither of them was capable. Franklin, who had grown up secure in his family's love and at the center of his mother's world, wanted unquestioning adoration, which Eleanor, who was given to often critical frankness, was unable to give. Eleanor, denied the security of a consistent and loving family, wanted to be loved for herself above all others, but also wanted someone in whom she could confide with total honesty, who would always take her side. Franklin could not be that partner with his divided loyalties among his wife, his mother, his family, and his legal and political career. Further, Eleanor admitted that she did not enjoy marital intimacy, viewing it as a burden to be dutifully shouldered. Nonetheless, the Roosevelt marriage was a prolific one, producing 6 children in 10 years: Anna, James, Franklin, Elliot, Franklin Jr., and John. Much additional strain accompanied the first years of married life for Eleanor due to her problematic relationship with Franklin's mother. And so, following their honeymoon, the newlyweds moved into a house in New York adjoining that of Eleanor's mother-in-law. Sarah Delano Roosevelt had always maintained an exceptionally close relationship with her only son, whose elderly father had died when Franklin was still a teenager, and she had thereafter always maintained a proprietary interest and involvement in her son's affairs. A large part of Eleanor's unhappiness during these years stemmed from friction with Sarah, who was constantly trying to assert her matronly presence and position in the Roosevelt household, frequently to the point of pushing Eleanor aside as the lady of the house. The eldest son, James, recollected that their grandmother had once insisted to them that she, not Eleanor, was their real mother. While Franklin was frequently absent and busy building his legal career, and later his political career, he delighted in his children and was a very loving, involved, and active father when at home or on vacation with his family. In contrast, Eleanor later wrote, she herself had always had reservations about her ability to understand or to care for children, and found it very difficult to show overt affection toward them. She reflected that she did not take to motherhood with the secure happiness she had expected. Eleanor's relationship with her own mother had always been detached emotionally, and she had received little warmth from subsequent caregivers after Anna's death. It is also possible that her relationship with her rather domineering mother-in-law may have also contributed to her conviction of her own parental shortcomings. Sarah was also often critical of Eleanor's physical appearance as her mother, Anna, had once been. Perhaps a more supportive environment in her early life or in her early married life might have given Eleanor greater confidence, comfort, and joy in her own marriage as well as in motherhood. Before their first wedding anniversary, Eleanor confronted Franklin about her dissatisfaction with their home life. I did not like to live in a house, she later wrote, which was not in any way mine, one that I had done nothing about, and which did not represent the way I wanted to live. She had had no part in choosing or decorating the family home, and Sarah maintained full supervision of all domestic activities. Franklin assured her that she would settle in time, but few changes were made, and Eleanor grew more dissatisfied. One of the few places she felt at home was at her children's cottage, a charmingly simple and rustic affair on the family's holiday estate on Campobello Island, New Brunswick in Canada. It was during a family vacation at Campobello in 1909 that the young Roosevelt family suffered a painful tragedy. Their third son, Franklin, who was not yet a year old, died after a short illness related to a heart condition. Eleanor was devastated and blamed herself, believing that the child had been left too often with nurses and nannies, and that if she had been a better mother, she might have somehow had the power to help him. The sympathy from her mother-in-law and their mutual loss softened Eleanor's relationship with Sarah somewhat. Thereafter, Sarah tried to be warmer and more supportive toward her daughter-in-law, although she never ceased her proprietary approach toward her son's family or her criticism of her son's wife. Eleanor gave birth to her fourth child, Elliot, less than a year after losing baby Franklin, and 2 more boys, Franklin Jr. and John, during the next 5 years. Eleanor suffered yet more pain and resentment when 2 years after the birth of their last child, she discovered that Franklin had been having a love affair with her social secretary Lucy Mercer for several years. It came to light that Franklin had also discreetly explored the possibility of divorcing Eleanor, a prospect which both his mother and his political advisors had vetoed immediately. A divorce, it was believed, would kill Franklin's career, not to mention disgrace the family. Sarah even threatened her son with disinheritance. It was around this time that the Roosevelt marriage began to evolve. For the rest of her life, Eleanor remained deeply hurt and felt betrayed by her husband's unfaithfulness. Lucy was beautiful, young, sweet, and adored Franklin in the unreasoning and unreserved way that Eleanor could not. The affair seemed a confirmation that no one would ever love her enough in the way that she wanted to be loved, and that she would always move on an outer perimeter, even within her own family. At the same time, however, Eleanor was an eminently practical person and resolved to cultivate the best possible relationship with Franklin, one that became primarily a political and public service partnership, but which also retained a close intimacy based on a shared family, a shared past, respect and admiration for one another's intellectual and emotional capacities, and a strong desire for one another's approval. Franklin's affairs continued throughout their marriage, albeit very discreetly. Lucy Mercer remained an intermittent presence in his romantic life, and he also had a prolonged liaison with his longtime secretary, Marguerite Lahand, known as Missy. Even though Franklin's infidelities hurt her, Eleanor was, in some ways, set free by the new status quo in her marriage. In addition to her innate practicality, Eleanor Roosevelt was part of a generation and class of people who almost never divorced. Instead, couples unhappy in their marriages frequently came to arrangements with one another to lead largely separate lives with some concessions to public appearances as a family. The Roosevelt marriage was certainly a closer one than was typical of such arrangements, and when apart, Franklin and Eleanor corresponded almost daily. Increasingly, however, Eleanor did find that she was leading two lives throughout the years of her marriage. There was her public life as wife, mother, and active social reformer. Then there was her private life, largely separate from her family, where she formed several intense romantic relationships throughout her lifetime, both during her marriage and in her widowhood. Those close to the Roosevelts lamented their seemingly unhappy marriage. Franklin's cousin Daisy once wrote about what a pity it was that Franklin and Eleanor did not get along so well, since they were both individually such fine people. Still, Eleanor and Franklin remained a solid family unit. When he was stricken with polio beginning in 1921, Eleanor was utterly devoted to his care and recovery. Further, she wholeheartedly supported and defended his decision to continue pursuing his political career, against the advice of his mother, who would have preferred that her son retire to a more sedate life, less taxing on his physical strength. Franklin, a great admirer of his enormously popular cousin, the late President Theodore Roosevelt, was no less ambitious to reach the same lofty heights of achievement as Teddy had. Eleanor thereafter became one of Franklin's most important advisors, remaining actively involved in the formation of his perspectives and policies throughout his political career, including his later presidency. She took over some of his political engagements and began to give speeches in support of his candidacy and initiatives. Her biographers have described her as Franklin's social conscience, an important ally, unlike the typically sycophantic political operatives which politicians must often rely upon. Eleanor never hesitated to personally visit communities to see for herself the conditions under which people lived and worked, and she remained guided by her own empathy and compassion. She therefore proved invaluable to Franklin by providing honest and frank evaluations of how enacted policies worked on the ground and what initiatives might be needed to improve conditions for as many people as possible. Most significantly, she could make her evaluations and recommendations unbounded by concern for political consequences and in the interest of the public good. During the First World War years, Franklin served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy in President Woodrow Wilson's cabinet. Although despite his desire to serve overseas, Franklin did not see any real military action. Eleanor worked with the Red Cross through the years of the Great War, and in spite of her fear of those with mental health issues, a residual fear left over from a difficult childhood with multiple alcoholic and delusional family members, Eleanor visited and thoroughly assessed veterans' hospitals to familiarize herself with the trauma which former soldiers were going through and how best to help them. She took the experience as a lesson that one should always attempt that which is frightening and intimidating nonetheless, and thus become stronger. By the time she reached her mid-30s, with her childbearing years behind her, Eleanor began to dedicate more of her time to her work for social reform once again, and began to gain a public reputation which matched the growing political influence of her husband. She formed both professional relationships and personal friendships with several women active in the Democratic Party, within the ranks of which her husband was also rising, and set to work on various charitable, educational, social justice, and labor justice initiatives. She became involved with the League of Women Voters, befriending the noted suffragettes and reformers Esther Lape and Elizabeth Reed, and working for multiple causes alongside them. Eleanor, along with her female compatriots, campaigned for Democratic candidates and voted for the first time, along with many other American women, in the election of 1920. Through her association with the Women's Trade Union League, Eleanor worked for improved conditions in low-income urban areas and for humane labor standards such as a fair minimum wage, a workweek not exceeding 48 hours, and an end to child labor. With two of her new friends among the influential women of the Democratic Party, Marion Dickerman and Nancy Cook, Eleanor helped establish the Todd Hunter School for Girls in New York, a finishing school and college preparatory academy where she spent 3 years teaching history and literature classes, emphasizing independent thinking and an active social conscience to her students, just as Madame Souvestre had stressed in her lessons when Eleanor had been her student. In 1927, in partnership with Dickerman and Cook, Eleanor also established Val-Kill Industries, which provided jobs to poor rural families manufacturing colonial-style furniture and homespun decor for sale. The three women also worked together campaigning for Democratic candidate Alfred E. Smith for president in the 1924 and 1928 elections. Eleanor also simultaneously campaigned for Franklin's bid for governor of New York in 1928. Franklin was victorious, and the family moved into the governor's mansion in the New York capital at Albany. All of this activity served to help Eleanor forge her own independent path, separate from her family, although she did remain closely connected to her husband and children. Additionally, her increasing involvement in public life and service removed her somewhat from the force of her mother-in-law's criticism and control, which had largely taken place in domestic rather than public settings. Predictably, Sarah was disapproving of Eleanor's reform activities and new friends, believing that her daughter-in-law should have given up her work for the Red Cross and all other causes following the end of the war and returned to her domestic role as wife and mother. The idea of returning to the life of socialite domesticity seemed to Eleanor a dull waste of time and energy. "During my early marriage," she later wrote, "I lived according to my mother-in-law's pattern, and later, my children's pattern." Now, Eleanor was ready to strike out in a more independent direction that was meaningful to her. She and Franklin commissioned the construction of a separate workspace and cottage in Hyde Park, a short distance from the Roosevelt Springwood estate and separate from the family home, where Eleanor could work, entertain her friends, and make the place her own. Val-Kill Cottage eventually became Eleanor's permanent residence during the difficult period after Franklin's death many years later. With Eleanor's increased activity on behalf of Franklin's political career, as well as her own projects, she began to travel a great deal more during the years following Franklin's election as governor. She was extremely independent and liked to travel alone, driving herself in her own car. Her increased travel schedule spurred Franklin to hire a bodyguard for her. Earl Miller, a former New York State trooper, came to work in the Roosevelt household in 1929. Young, fair-haired, handsome, and friendly, Earl quickly developed a close relationship with Eleanor, who was now 44 to his 32. The exact nature of their relationship is hard to ascertain, but Eleanor's biographers tend to agree that for at least a few years, the bond between Earl and Eleanor was a romantic one. He remained one of her closest and most intimate friends for the next 3 decades, until Eleanor's death. The reason that the nature of the relationship between Miller and Roosevelt is still murky is because the bulk of the many, many letters which the two wrote to one another over the course of 30 years have been lost. It is believed that they may have been intentionally destroyed or discreetly purchased and sealed within a private collection just prior to Eleanor's death. But whatever their exact relationship, scholars believe that Miller was probably Eleanor's first serious romantic entanglement since the painful revelations of Franklin's infidelities a decade before. Those experiences had dealt a serious blow to her self-esteem. The experience of finally being loved for herself and by someone who expected nothing more of her than that she should simply be herself likely gave Eleanor some of the confidence she had been lacking, enabling her to proceed ever more bravely and boldly into the public sphere, and inspiring her to pursue a fulfilling life on her own terms, as Franklin had always done. When Franklin won the presidency in 1932, Eleanor was, as one of her biographers put it, rather reluctant to approach her position as First Lady. While she had been highly active in public life and service for many years already, she was apprehensive about the substance of the position itself. Traditionally, the First Lady served in a role with minimal responsibility and limited public exposure. Most wives of presidents had never been much more than domestic hostesses at the White House. Eleanor Roosevelt expanded the role of First Lady enormously and is still one of the most, if not the most, well-known and well-loved women to have ever held the position. Part of the reason for her continued active involvement in politics and social reform during her husband's presidency, especially on his behalf, stemmed from the fact that Eleanor had already been performing such a role for many years. Yet, previous First Ladies had had occupations, causes, and ambitions which they had given up when their husbands attained the presidency. Lou Henry Hoover had been a committed feminist activist prior to Herbert Hoover's successful election in 1928, a cause from which she distanced herself upon becoming First Lady. When Edith Wilson stepped into an active administrative role on behalf of her husband, Woodrow Wilson, after he suffered a debilitating stroke near the end of his presidency, she assumed those duties in an extremely discreet and covert fashion, largely to keep any indication of her husband's precarious health quiet. Eleanor Roosevelt also helped her husband to shoulder the many duties which his already demanding work schedule and physical condition made difficult, and thus helped to minimize any public impression of Franklin's disability. However, her determination to engage with the position of First Lady in such a public, assertive, and independent-minded manner as she did set her apart from other presidential wives who had previously occupied the White House. Eleanor had changed since the rocky early years of her marriage and Franklin's illness. No longer would she be awkward and aloof in company or in public, feeling inadequate to every situation. The friendships and relationships she had formed, the causes and initiatives she had embraced, and the political experience she had gained gave her the impetus and confidence to be more active, involved, and influential in the political process and in public life than any First Lady had ever been. In the final months of Franklin's presidential campaign in 1932, Eleanor met Lorena Hickok, a 37-year-old female reporter assigned by the Associated Press to cover the Democratic candidate's wife. The two formed an intimate and close bond almost immediately that was to last the rest of Eleanor's life. Her biographers report that Lorena fell deeply in love with the First Lady. Finding it impossible to write about Eleanor for the public in any remotely impartial or detached fashion, she quit her newspaper job and went to work instead as part of the Roosevelt's White House staff. Eleanor, and Hick, as she affectionately nicknamed her, were constant companions through the White House years of the 1930s and early 40s, and when apart, wrote effusive, emotional, and lengthy letters to one another daily, each as long as 15 pages. Many of these letters survive, unlike the letters between Eleanor and Earl Miller, and Eleanor's relationship with Lorena Hickok is, therefore, quite a bit clearer. Despite the obvious passion and romantic feelings which seem to be fairly clearly expressed in these letters, scholars have often been notably reluctant to describe Eleanor and Lorena's relationship as romantic. "I cannot kiss you," Eleanor once wrote to Lorena, "so I kiss your picture good night and good morning." She wrote also about her longing to see Lorena and her assurance that no one in the world meant to Eleanor quite what Lorena did. Some historians have cautioned readers and history students not to make romantic or sexual suppositions about Roosevelt and Hickok which can never be fully proven, or to infer a sexual orientation which historical figures did not claim for themselves. Conversely, other historians insist that the letters clearly demonstrate that there was a physically intimate side to Roosevelt's and Hickok's relationship, and that the letters are undeniably indicative of romantic love. Similar sentiments expressed in letters between a man and woman would lead one to a conclusion of romantic love almost immediately. Yet only in the last few decades have scholars begun to openly acknowledge what was very likely the truth of their relationship. Historians, who warn that observers should not impose the identity of a lesbian on Eleanor Roosevelt when she did not claim it for herself, make a very good point. All biographers and biographies are ultimately speculating about particular details which cannot be gleaned from existing sources. However, one must also acknowledge that Eleanor was part of a generation which never openly declared sexual orientation. This is not to say that same-sex relationships were unknown to most of society. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the reality was quite the reverse, with women living together openly in what were termed Boston marriages. But heteronormativity was an all-encompassing cultural force, as it continues to be today in many cultures. It was known among the White House press corps that Lorena Hickok was a lesbian, yet traditionally, historians have often shied away from characterizing her relationship with Eleanor as anything but an exceptionally close friendship. Eleanor, as a married woman with children and probably one of the most famous women in the world by the end of her husband's presidency, could never have openly declared a romantic relationship with a woman. It is also possible that she never really thought about her sexual orientation at all. But the fact remains that Eleanor came as close as she could to such a declaration by forming a romantic relationship and close friendships with several lesbian women. Esther Lape and Elizabeth Reed, alongside whom Eleanor had worked for the League of Women Voters, were a couple, as were Eleanor's friends and partners in Valkill Industries and the Todhunter School, Marion Dickerman and Nancy Cook. One of the women Eleanor admired most in the world, her beloved schoolmistress at Allenswood, Madame Souvestre, was also known to have been a lesbian. So, Roosevelt certainly showed an understanding and an acceptance of same-sex relationships, and she seems to have had at least one herself. However, she also had romantic and intimate relationships with men, as well as close personal friendships with both heterosexual and homosexual couples throughout her life. This dimension of Eleanor's life is probably the one with the most questions and controversy still surrounding it, and for that reason, some historians believe it deserves more investigation. Whatever her sexual identity, Eleanor nonetheless pursued happy relationships in her private life, with one foot still in the heteronormative world of her husband and children. But in the larger sense, Eleanor often operated in the spaces between what was acceptable and what was controversial, in order to produce the change she wanted to see in the world. Another interesting dimension of Eleanor's life, however, Eleanor's objection to this proposed constitutional amendment was based on her belief that it would hurt and disadvantage working-class women and their families. She advocated instead for initiatives such as subsidized daycare programs and an expansion of public education to help working women shoulder the dual burdens of breadwinning and child-rearing, concerns which middle-class and elite women did not have to deal with. She worked hard to influence her husband's New Deal programs to ensure that women would not be underserved by them and would be offered the widest variety of job opportunities possible. As First Lady, Eleanor gave over 350 press conferences at the White House during Franklin's presidency. Lorena Hickok inspired her to reserve these events for women only, since only male reporters could attend President Roosevelt's press conferences. Both Lorena and Eleanor understood that if they allowed only female reporters to cover the First Lady's press conferences and events, this would encourage the news media to hire more women in general. And while Eleanor was cautioned to refrain from discussing specific policies and topics which were only in the purview of the President or of Congress, who were elected officials, Eleanor is often not remembered is her feminism. Feminist scholars, including historians, tend to overlook Eleanor Roosevelt in their coverage of the most important figures in the 20th century feminist movement. There is a practical reason for this. Western historiography tends to divide the feminist movement into distinct periods into which Roosevelt does not fit. Feminist history heavily emphasizes the suffragist movement of the early 20th century, in which Eleanor Roosevelt was not especially prominent. They also heavily emphasize the second-wave feminism of the 1960s. Eleanor died in 1962 and thus did not figure prominently in this second explosion of women's liberation either. Her contributions to women's rights and opportunities in the years between these two movements, however, were considerable, but far more left-wing in terms of approach than most of the more prominent middle-class feminists of the first and second waves of the movement. Eleanor advocated most heavily for working-class women, fighting for labor justice and against child labor. More middle-class feminists have expressed resentment of Roosevelt for her opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment during the early 20th century. However, nonetheless, expressed her opinions in general on various social, economic, and political issues which were important to her, in order to encourage greater communication as well as greater social and political involvement among women. Like FDR with his fireside chats, Eleanor Roosevelt made excellent strategic use of media in order to communicate with the public and encourage social and political mobilization. Throughout the first half of her husband's presidency, she wrote a daily newspaper column entitled My Day, which featured news, issues, and advice for women, as well as a monthly magazine column called If You Ask Me, which was first conceived as a campaign to further encourage familiarity with the Roosevelts in the White House, but which Eleanor frequently used as a platform to discuss more serious issues, which did not often find their way into mainstream women's publications, such as economics or international peace. Eleanor also hosted the nationally syndicated Mrs. Roosevelt's Own radio program, beginning in 1940, which aired every Sunday night on NBC. Beginning in 1932 and throughout the rest of her life, Eleanor published numerous books and essays and made hundreds of public speeches, most in support of democratic values and progressive causes. When one considers her numerous press conferences, speeches, publications, and the many, many letters she wrote daily to those dear to her, it seems safe to assume that Eleanor Roosevelt was one of the most prolific women writers of the 20th century. When criticized for being too vocal, even to the point of openly disagreeing with her husband's opinions and decisions, Eleanor did not shrink. She instead insisted that she often said controversial things to ensure that the issues in question would become more mainstream topics of conversation. Public awareness might thereby be raised, perhaps even leading to action. Most impressively, Eleanor donated all of the proceeds from her various sponsored publications and paid speaking engagements to charitable causes she believed in. Eleanor worked closely with Harry Hopkins on overseeing the proper implementation of Franklin's New Deal programs during the Great Depression, so that they might benefit as many Americans as equitably as possible. She was particularly invested in the success of the National Youth Administration, which aimed to provide jobs for young people aged 16 to 24. Her pet project was the planned community Arthurdale near Morgantown, West Virginia. Lorena Hickok had been investigating the conditions in communities in the region on behalf of Secretary of Commerce Harry Hopkins, and advised Eleanor to visit Morgantown if she wanted to see just how bleak life had become for various American regions since the advent of the Great Depression. The First Lady was deeply affected by the plight of the people in Morgantown, most of whom were unemployed miners, blacklisted from virtually the only employment opportunity in the area because of their attempt to organize a union. Adequate shelter, as well as reasonable access to food and clean water, were not at all assured. Families shared their indoor accommodation with any livestock they were still lucky enough to own. Some families were even sleeping in caves and culverts. Eleanor was determined to adopt the whole town, moving all of the inhabitants to a planned community, which she hoped could eventually become self-supporting. Franklin enthusiastically supported Eleanor's vision, making Arthurdale a New Deal program, and Eleanor poured nearly all of her own income into the project. While the town itself has been called a failure by some historians, with the last of the land being sold off by the government in 1942, Eleanor had the satisfaction of seeing many of the town's families get back on their feet financially and remain stable for years afterwards, thanks to their residency and support at Arthurdale. Experiences with planned communities like Arthurdale highlighted for Eleanor the fact that while the New Deal was doing a great deal of good for various American communities hard hit by the Depression, help was not being given equally to all Americans. The residents of several planned communities, including Arthurdale, refused to allow African American or Jewish miners and their families to live in their towns. She was shocked to discover that the planned community established in West Virginia the year before Arthurdale, named Eleanor in her honor, was in fact a sundown town, meaning that any person of color remaining within the town limits after sundown might be harassed, forcibly expelled, arrested, or even subjected to violence. Having initially hoped to establish diverse communities, she was dejected at being defeated in town meetings, at which the white residents invariably voted to restrict residency to white Christians only. Eleanor Roosevelt thereafter became much more active and vocal in the cause of civil rights. When it became clear to her that widespread American racism was affecting the administration of New Deal initiatives in African American communities, she was quick to pressure her husband and his administration to adjust their strategy to ensure that black men, women, and children benefited from these programs as much as white Americans. Despite her best efforts, only about a third of black Americans in need received both regular and sufficient support from the New Deal. Eleanor was determined to do more and began to cultivate working relationships and friendships with noted black activists and civil rights leaders, such as Walter White, chairman of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and Mary McLeod Bethune, the prominent educator and activist. The Roosevelt administration exceeded previous administrations in the appointment of African Americans to federal jobs and established a much more comprehensive advisory system on civil rights within the White House. Franklin, however, as the Democratic Party leader and president, was dependent on the cooperation and support of white segregationist politicians, primarily from the South, who wielded enormous power within Congress. Franklin, or FDR as he is perhaps better known, therefore declined to publicly back a bill which would make lynching a federal crime. Racially motivated violence against African Americans, particularly black men and boys, had been prevalent in the South since the Reconstruction period following the American Civil War, most particularly since the 1890s. Segregationist politicians decried the anti-lynching bill as a usurpation of state rights and legal jurisdiction. FDR refused to meet with Walter White when he asked for a meeting to discuss the anti-lynching bill. Eleanor, therefore, personally invited the NAACP's leader to the White House for tea, making sure that Franklin would be present as well. Both Walter and Eleanor were deeply disappointed at the president's lack of public support for the bill, despite his assurance that he would gladly sign it if it passed in Congress, which it sadly did not. And although it was revived again and again during the 20th century, the current incarnation of this bill, the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act, has still not achieved full passage under the current 117th Congress. While her husband showed muted support for the civil rights of African Americans during his presidency for political reasons, Eleanor conversely became more active in the movement, and her pointed support drew a great many black voters away from the Republican Party and into the Democratic Party. Eleanor was devoted to expanding education, training, and opportunities for African Americans, advocating for an end to segregation and structural disadvantage, and improving overall conditions for black communities throughout the remainder of her life. One of her more notable public gestures, encouraging the civil rights movement, was her invitation to the black opera singer Marian Anderson, whom the organization known as Daughters of the American Revolution had refused to allow to perform in Independence Hall, as Washington, D.C. was still segregated. Eleanor, who had been a long-time member of the DAR, promptly withdrew her membership from the organization and asked Anderson to perform on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. Anderson's rendition of My Country, 'Tis of Thee remains an iconic sound and video recording in American 20th century history. When World War II broke out, Eleanor found ways to support the war effort while still maintaining a focus on her domestic social reform agenda. She visited the American troops and performed inspections in England in October 1942, and also visited the American forces in their various posts in the South Pacific in November of 1943. She drew admiring crowds to the events she attended and made speeches at, and her personal touch was much remarked upon with approval. Admiral Halsey had been wearily and resentfully anticipating her visit, saying that he had no time to chaperone some do-gooder while she took advantage of a photo opportunity. At the conclusion of her visit, however, he praised her conduct and commitment to the well-being of the men serving. When Eleanor inspected a facility, she did not just cut the ribbon, shake a few hands, take a commemorative photo, and then leave, but stopped to talk to as many people as possible. At the military hospitals she visited, she stopped for a brief chat with nearly every patient on the ward. GIs recalled Mrs. Roosevelt's greeting them warmly and asking if they were being treated well, if they had everything they needed, if there was anything she could do for them. On the domestic side, Eleanor advocated for greater employment opportunities for women and African Americans in wartime industries, particularly in manufacturing and skilled trades. Above all, she believed everyone deserved a chance to be useful and to advance and profit as a result of their service. Eleanor also provided personal and financial support for the expansion of the pilot training program at the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, a historically black college and trade school, helping to finance the building of Moton Airfield and supporting the creation of the first all-black unit of fighter pilots. Eleanor emerged from the war, like many others, utterly changed by what she had seen, and mourning those who had been lost. The savagery and brutality of the war, not only on the troops, but on the civilians and refugees, such as European Jews, had inspired Eleanor to work for a greater commitment from the United States to care for refugees, particularly from the Nazi regime. One of her greatest sorrows was her inability to persuade Roosevelt, his administration or Congress to reconsider the rejection of most Jewish refugees, or to convince her husband to halt Executive Order 9066, which provided for the creation of internment camps in which 110,000 Japanese Americans were imprisoned during the war. On the 12th of April 1945, Franklin died of a cerebral brain hemorrhage at his home in Warm Springs, Georgia, named the Little White House. He had not sent for Eleanor in his final days, and she later learned from her eldest daughter Anna, who had been caring for Franklin in his final illness, that Eleanor's erstwhile social secretary and Franklin's old flame Lucy Mercer, now Mrs. Lucy Rutherford, had been at his side instead, and that for many years Franklin had discreetly continued to see her. Eleanor's grief at Franklin's passing and her pain at what seemed his final rejection of her made her angry with Anna for a time for having kept these details from her mother. The two soon reconciled, however, and it would be Anna who would care for Eleanor herself during her final illness. Eleanor emerged from the war as an internationalist, as her husband had always been. The international conflicts of the early 20th century and their interference with human progress convinced her of the need for comprehensive international cooperation, dedicated to world peace and humanitarian aims. Eleanor's work for the UN during the immediate post-war period and her role in the formation and passage of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights are among her most important achievements. The Declaration incorporated Franklin Roosevelt's 4 freedoms of speech, worship, economic security, and personal safety. Eleanor remained the chairperson of the Committee on Human Rights until 1953, working especially hard to address and alleviate world hunger. She received several international awards and honors for her service to the United Nations and the cause of human rights, both during her lifetime and posthumously. During the 1950s, Eleanor continued to advocate for and support progressive and humanitarian causes, traveling internationally, delivering literally hundreds of speeches, and continuing her syndicated publication and broadcasting activities. She continued to be a champion for causes she believed in, inspiring millions to become more socially conscious and engaged. Indeed, a poll undertaken by the Gallup organization in 1999 ranked Eleanor Roosevelt in the top 10 most admired people of the 20th century. However, Eleanor was not universally well liked, and her left-leaning, pro-labor, pro-civil rights positions earned her many political enemies throughout her career in public service. J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, was rumored to have kept extensive files on Eleanor Roosevelt, not only for her pro-union stance, but also for her open support for the civil rights movement, both believed by many American legal and political authorities to be associated with communism. Segregationists and white supremacists blamed the influence of Eleanor Roosevelt when rioting broke out in black communities in Detroit in 1943, and in the South, white supremacists spread propaganda about organized groups of black domestic workers committed to terrorizing their white female employers. There is, however, no evidence that any of these so-called Eleanor clubs ever existed at all. During her work for the UN, Eleanor met Dr. David Gurevich, the organization's first medical director. He became not only her personal physician, but also one of her closest friends after Franklin's death. Eleanor's biographers described the relationship as romantic, but apparently only from Eleanor's side, who was now in her mid-60s, while David was nearly 20 years younger. The two traveled the world together throughout the next decade, on Eleanor's various campaigns and engagements. David was deeply devoted to her, but continually refused to address her as anything less formal than Mrs. Roosevelt. When David became engaged to his future wife Edna, Eleanor at first feared she would lose him. Instead, Eleanor and David co-purchased a roomy house on East 60th Street in Manhattan, and the three of them lived together quite amicably and companionably until Eleanor's death a decade later. In 1960, President John F. Kennedy reappointed Eleanor Roosevelt to lead the American delegation to the UN. He also appointed her to chair the Commission on the Status of Women, which assessed conditions in women's employment and educational outcomes, and made policy recommendations to facilitate women's greater advancement in American society. Kennedy also selected Eleanor as a member of the committee to lead negotiations with Fidel Castro for the return of American prisoners after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba. Finally, she was instrumental in the development and implementation of President Kennedy's International Youth Service Initiative, the Peace Corps. Eleanor's health began to fail following the spring of 1960 when she was diagnosed with anemia. Her doctors prescribed steroids designed to encourage her bone marrow to release more red blood cells. Sadly, the medication reduced her body's ability to fight infections and resurrected a dormant tuberculosis infection which Eleanor had contracted some unknown number of years before. Determined not to die in hospital, Eleanor discharged herself from professional care in mid-October of 1962, returning to the Manhattan townhouse she shared with her friends and companions, David and Edna Gurevich. She then suffered a cerebrovascular stroke, dying on the 7th of November. She was 78 years old. Eleanor Roosevelt was universally mourned. President Kennedy ordered all flags and standards lowered to half-mast all over the country and at American government and diplomatic posts all over the world. Her funeral was attended by 4 presidents: Truman, Eisenhower, Johnson, and Kennedy, all of whom paid warm and sincere tribute to her as one of the well-loved and remarkable women of the 20th century. Eleanor was laid to rest beside Franklin in the Rose Garden at their Springwood estate at Hyde Park, which is now the Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum. The prominent Democrat, Adlai Stevenson, said of her in his eulogy, "She would rather light a candle than curse the darkness, and her glow has warmed the world." What do you think of Eleanor Roosevelt? Let us know in the comments below. And as always, thank you very much for watching.